Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Africa CEO Forum. I am Andres SCHIPANI, the Eastern Central Africa Bureau Chief with the Financial Times of London. I'm based in Nairobi, and that's where I met this towering figure of Africa, Kenya's President William Ruto. Please send applause to the President. And karibu, Mr. President. Thank you very much for being here at the Kigali Convention Center.
Thank you, my friend. How are you?
How are you?
Very good.
Great to see you again. Pleasure. Mr. President, thank you very, very much. You can please sit. Yeah? Yes, everybody can sit now. Mr. President, thank you very much for being here in Kigali today. I mean, you landed this morning, I guess, and you saw some clouds, but it's been quite sunny here in Kigali. And the last time we spoke, about a month ago, in Nairobi, Kenya was enduring devastating floods. In fact, we had to stop the interview for a few seconds because there was a big thunderstorm. You were hosting the IDA conference. And I'm bringing this up now because you have been taking quite a strong leadership in pushing the rich world to fund Africa's energy transition and overall funding to tackle climate change. From the Nairobi Declaration last year at the Nairobi Climate Summit, it said it should involve a transfer of resources to a continent that is basically obliged to adapt to this climate crisis that is not of its own making. How do you see the near future of this resource transfer?
Thank you very much, and for giving me this opportunity to engage on one of the most pressing challenges of our time. Matters around climate change, matters around debt distress occasioned by climate change, compounded by COVID-19, the wars in Europe and everywhere else. We had a candid conversation, and we decided as leaders in this continent that it was enough for us to be profiled as victims, and our continent to be profiled mostly negatively around conflict and war and poverty and disease and negative things. So we decided that for the first time we want to write our own narrative. And we started at the Africa Climate Summit, that Africa, aside from being victim of all this, we have real solutions, not just for African problems, but we have real solutions for global challenges. One of them is climate change. And we made the proposition that there is a close correlation between climate change, development, and financing. And it is the reason why we have strongly proposed that we need a rethink, a re-engineering of the international financial architecture to make it nimble, to make it, to update it, so that it speaks to the current challenges. And secondly, that we need to look at Africa not as what it has always been, but as a continent of opportunity. And we want to move that huge, tremendous potential we have to opportunity all the way to investment. Yes, we have serious challenges. We walked, for example, if I talk about Kenya, a year ago we were in a devastating drought that decimated 2.5 million heads of livestock in Kenya, 9.4 million of livestock in the Horn of Africa, in 4 countries. But we came straight into floods that has destroyed livelihoods, infrastructure. 200 people have been lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands lost livelihoods. We had to close schools for 2 weeks. So climate change is a reality that we live. And more often than not, we have to divert resources that are meant for social amenities, schools, hospitals, medicine. We have to divert those resources to provide attention to mitigate the challenges of climate change, put more money in developing infrastructure. We've had to rebuild schools. We've had to provide money for people who are displaced. In Nairobi alone, we had close to 15,000 families displaced. We've had to provide resources from them from yesterday. We are paying families so that they can find alternative settlements. That is the reality of where we are. But what are we? This year, I held a meeting of IDA with the World Bank, and we have made concrete propositions on how this can be achieved. We are pushing for $120 billion replenishment of IDA resources that are concessional. And why are we saying IDA?
This year.
For this year.
For this year.
And this is because IDA is not just concessional, it is 40 years, and it can leverage the private sector resources. It can leverage the markets up to 4 times. So if we have $1 billion, it quickly becomes $3.5–4 billion. So this is the space we are speaking to, and we believe we are going to make a case. In fact, it's going to be one of the conversations I'm going to have with Congress when I go to the US and the US leadership, because yes, we have challenges, but we have concrete propositions on how we believe these challenges can be sorted out.
We can go back to your trip to the US later, but I think you made a very good point. I mean, I personally am interested in this more fair financing. I mean, I was born in Latin America and raised in the 1980s, structural adjustment programs, debt crisis, Brady plans. We're still paying for that sometimes. But you said so now, last year in Paris, in Nairobi, at the IDA conference. Can you please run us through the proposals? Because how do you really, because one of the things that you want more representation from Africa at the World Bank and the IMF, are the actual governing bodies. But how do you really think the richer world, especially now that you're going to Washington, is reacting to your proposals and to this idea that, okay, we need a more fair, more equitable financial system, we need to be much more part of it?
When the current multilateral development banks came into being in 1945, countries like Kenya did not exist. And yet, Kenya is now the 7th largest, maybe 6th largest economy in Africa. We're a big player. And yet, our status is neither here nor there. It is time that we have a new conversation, because the lenders are important, but the borrowers are important too. Because development partnership has 2 components on both sides. So we must have a candid conversation so that we have an organization that is democratic, that is representative, so that all of us have an equal voice on what happens. And that is why when we had the meeting of IDA, we put our propositions on the table. We believe there should be a fairer, more balanced representation at the multilateral development banks boards, so that our voice, our ideas, our suggestions are on the table. That's number 1. Number 2, we believe that we must go for a win-win outcome. Where do we put more resources? Do we put more resources in expensive loans, or do we put more resources in concessional loans? Our proposal is that the concessional window of resources has many benefits. Number 1, it is concessional. Number 2, it is long-term. Number 3, it is easy for it to be leveraged, private sector, to enhance those resources. And number 3, the international community is now awake to the reality that what we are saying is not what everybody thinks. What we are saying makes sense, that we need a fairer system. When Kenya, for example, when we went to the financial markets in January, because I had to, we got resources to move forward at 11%, 10 point something percent. This is exactly what we've been saying. I mean, other countries access the same facilities at 1%. So if we are getting it at 10% and others are getting it at 1%, where is the fairness? How do we develop equally? This is the conversation we must have. When we say Africa is paying 5 times more, it is not just talk. It is a reality we live through every day. And that is why we are pushing every lever to make sure that concessional resources are available so that we can pull countries out of debt distress and we can do more for our citizens and do more for development so that countries don't spend more in servicing debt than in paying for medicine for their citizens.
I mean, there's a debate in some corners about this idea of the Africa premium. And then you, as you just said, I mean, you did quite a surprising and quite a successful bond buyback in January. But do you think Washington, Frankfurt, Brussels, London are listening to it? Because there's always the alternative. You have been having China, which some African countries have been having problems. Now the Gulf states have been becoming big investors as well in development in Africa. So from a more local perspective, for example, what can be done to manage Africa's debt sustainability in the longer run to avoid what happened to Ghana and Zambia in recent years, if the big capitals are not listening to that, the Africa premium, let's call it, should come down?
I don't think it is the case that they are not listening. I think they are. In fact, we have managed to move the debate from where it was to where it is. When we started this debate, the whole proposition of reforming the international financial architecture, nobody used to listen to it. Today, every country, from the US to European Union, to China, all of them have come to the conclusion that what we were saying, that the current international financial architecture is not fair, everybody has come to agree with us. And in fact, they are now asking, what is the mechanism of us to reform this financial architecture? So that's number one. I think we have a win there, that everybody now agrees there is a problem. This international financial architecture is not fair. That's number one. Number two, already there is a realization that what we have been saying, that we need more concessional resources, there is already a convergence of thoughts. And I could see it last 2 weeks when we had the IDA conference in Nairobi, that there is now a greater realization that African countries, countries in the developing world, need concessional, long-term, adequate resources. And number three, the World Bank, the IMF actually, has already come round. The SDR, special drawing rights, that initially benefited countries that did not need the money. Now, they have agreed that we need to rechannel the SDRs through, our proposal was Africa Development Bank, because that way it will get to more developing countries like Kenya, Rwanda, and others, and it will get to those countries at concessional rates. And again, those resources can be leveraged so that we get more resources into our economies. And let me say that this, apart from concessional resources, we need to do another 3 things. Number one, we need to enhance our capacity to mobilize domestic resources. And that's what we are doing in Kenya. We need to move our tax as a percentage of our GDPs progressively from 10%. Kenya is currently at 15%. We believe we should be at 20%. we believe further down the road we should be at 25% of GDP. Number three, we need to have policies that support value addition. We have been a continent exporting raw materials for far too long. It is time, as a continent, that we begin to add value to every product that we have. And that is why Kenya, for example, has 6 new special economic zones. That is why we are looking at incentives, including in one of our special economic zones, we have brought down the cost of power to 5 shillings, Kenya shillings. That's about 3.5 US cents. So we are looking at what is it that we can do to get manufacturing, to get value addition going so that we can enhance our exports as a percentage of GDP. And then fourthly, we need to deal with wastage, pilferage, and corruption so that resources that are meant for development benefit the majority of the people and not cartels and a few people.
On point number 1, you can have a pool of where to pick and choose. I mean, IDA is one. I mean, if I remember correctly, IDA was quite successful in pushing first South Korea, then China, then India, then Brazil into, in the case of South Korea, advanced status, the others middle income status. But it's not the only source. I mean, you can start tapping to different sources. Number 2, taxes. Isn't that politically risky? I mean, you've been experiencing some unease at home, so taxes are always politically sensitive. You told me that you wouldn't sacrifice popularity for the sake of sacrificing what's good for the sake of the country for popularity, but taxes are always a hot potato. And on number 3, we're going to talk about on your trip to the US, because I think that's one of the things that you're going to go to Washington for, is to attract different kind of investments. Number 1, if I'm not mistaken, you're going to push for an extension of AGOA, but also you want more tech into Kenya. So as you said, have value added in general. I mean, not to rely on natural resource extraction, which could be something that could be emulated across Africa.
You know, when we talk about mobilizing domestic resources, it is the right thing to do. And it may not necessarily be popular. But you see, you have to decide whether you want to do the popular thing or the right thing. I mean, it's a choice one has to make. If you want to do the popular thing, you may end up nowhere. We have to be candid with ourselves. We have to explain, because the resources that we are looking from elsewhere are taxes of other people, right? So we have to think about how do we balance between what is popular and what makes us get out of the situation we are. That is one. Number 2, even as we focus, and you've said correctly, one of the focus that I will be pushing in Washington is trade and investment between the US and Africa. And one of the instruments that is in place is the Africa Growth and Opportunities Agreement. So AGOA is one big element that gives Africa quota-free, duty-free access to the huge American market. It is not about Kenya alone. It's about the continent. And it speaks to the subject I already said, value addition, agro-processing, manufacturing. How do we make sure that this market that is available to us as a continent, we don't send their raw materials? We create jobs locally, we create value locally, and export finished products. That way, we get more value. So that is one aspect. But even as I speak to that, we also need to be organized. And this is a conversation also we intend to have internally as a continent. President Kagame did a wonderful job with the reform of the Africa Union. A job in the last summit of the AU, he handed over to me. I intend to complete the job President Kagame started of reforming the Africa Union so that it is fit for purpose and it focuses on three critical things. Number one, it becomes a clearer, louder voice for our continent. Credible, speaking for 1.4 billion people. Clearer in the sense that we were initially a liberation movement. That's now behind us. All countries in the continent are liberated. We need to refocus Africa Union so that it does our economic diplomacy. Number one, trade, investment. Number two, it becomes our instrument for peace and security. This continent is ravaged by conflict. We have war this way, that way, the other way. We must be able to manage conflict, reduce war, so that we can focus this continent as a continent of investment. Nobody will invest in our continent if there is conflict everywhere. AU must have a bigger muscle to speak to that issue. And number three, to make sure that AU focuses on matters infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I am talking about physical infrastructure, roads, railways. I am talking about digital infrastructure, making sure that we leverage on technology to make sure that we unlock the potential of the continent. I am talking about infrastructure broadly. Those are, in my opinion, the three things we must do to get the AU being focused so that it speaks for 1.4 billion people, gets our market organized so that we can trade, we can engage with other entities, whether it's the US, whether it is China, whether it is Europe, whether it is India, at par. And this is one of the assignments that we as leaders in this continent have taken it upon ourselves, that we are going to get organized so that we don't have a fragmented market. We have a voice that is loud, that is clear, that is focused around the AU.
Because one of the complaints, especially since the Africa Free Trade Pact was signed, that intra-Africa trade is still very low. I mean, there's still a lot of barriers. So I would like to assume that's part of your reform plan for the AU, because the goal seems clear, but how you get there?
Absolutely. It's why I am saying the Africa Union, we must reform it. And that's why President Kagame has been on this, and I've told you he's done a wonderful job. We are going for a retreat with the AU next month to agree on sharpening, making sure that AU is not focused on too many things. We are focused on three critical things so that we can enhance trade, not with the rest of the world only, but also within our continent. We need diplomacy around the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. There is a great realization by all of us of its importance, and that is why the Africa Continental Free Trade Area was signed and ratified in record time. There is no agreement that has received endorsement like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, because everybody realizes the importance of trade, of business, of investment, and eliminating barriers that hinder the private sector from doing what they must do, from trading between all our countries, making sure that our borders are not barriers, they are bridges to make goods, services, people move to different countries. It is the reason, for example, I have taken the decision that no African requires visa to come to Kenya. It's absolutely, it is absolutely ridiculous for anybody to expect somebody from Rwanda to look for a visa to come to Kenya. The people who introduced visas to us in Europe and told us visa is good, they have since abolished visa and left the visa to us. I mean, this is you don't need any visa to travel in the 28 countries in the European Union. So we are stuck here with colonial relics of stopping people from doing business and saying you must bring this paper, who is your grandmother, and those kind of things. So,
well, I have to say I'm a net benefit of that. I mean, I'm a Latin American, and here as I'm a resident of Kenya, I managed to travel from Kenya here just with an interstate pass. So it can be done.
So I think this is the space we are looking at, and we need to enhance, and grow our intra-Africa trade. It is anywhere around 14-15% at the moment. We are lucky that East Africa, where Rwanda and Kenya belong, we are way ahead at around 28%. We intend to trailblaze, to pull the rest of the continent to see the benefit of eliminating barriers, making sure that we enhance intra-Africa trade. Even as we look for trade partnerships with others, we must make sure that we leverage on the trade potential that exists within our continent. If Africa were to trade with itself to the levels where Europeans trade with itself, or people in Asia trade with themselves, 50-60%, this continent would possibly not require much of a market elsewhere. We have enough market here. And for us, we are lucky because it's a growing market. We have a young population.
That is going to grow
best
massively.
Workforce ever. A quarter of the world's population will be living here by 2050. So we have real potential, and we need to unlock it working with our private sector.
One last thing, Mr. President, thank you very much. You are making a big push on digital. That is also part of your trip to the US. In Africa, especially South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, here in Rwanda, is bustling with startups, people thinking of the next good thing. But the previous panel was about manufacturing and that how it hasn't really taken off as ideally as much as some people have liked it to. Do you think Africa is going to make the jump? I mean, Asia and Latin America to an extent is sort of like when step by step, let's say, going through industrialized phase and then make the jump to digital. Do you think Africa is going to jump from natural resource extraction to digital? Or there will be a bit of a balance that will serve everyone?
The digital revolution in Africa is a present reality. I believe very strongly that technology, the digital space, is going to be the game changer for our continent. In fact, one of the discussions we are going to have is with Microsoft and G42 from the UAE, is how to leverage on our renewable energy in Kenya to establish the biggest $10 billion data center in Kenya. Not just to service Kenya, but to service the region. Because we see in ourselves that technology is, we can leapfrog many years into the future. We have a young, tech-savvy population. If you needed evidence, the penetration of mobile phones in this continent is amazing. So technology and the digital space is going to leapfrog our continent. We need to focus. And for your information, the digital space and technology is not just good in itself. We can use it to get all our other potential assets, whether it's our human capital or smart agriculture or green minerals, technology can help us unlock that potential in record time. So I am very confident that digital infrastructure, and this is one thing I believe part of the reform of the Africa Union, we must refocus Africa Union in building and focusing on infrastructure, roads, rail, technology, digital infrastructure, so that we can unlock the potential of this continent in record time.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The last thing, can you give us a quick teaser of what will be the key thing that you will discuss with President Biden next week? That is Africa related, not just Kenya.
3 things. I'm so clear in my mind. 3 things. 1, how we can work with the US on matters to do with the economy, especially how the US can lead the way, being a major stakeholder in the World Bank and IMF, to make sure that there is concessional resources in the concessional windows of the multilateral development banks, so that countries like Kenya, like Rwanda, in this region can access concessional resources, and we should not get our countries going into debt distress, number 1. Number 2, how we can work together to make sure that our continent is stable and peaceful. How we can leverage on friendships to make sure that we work together on the reform of the AU to make sure that this continent is stable, is secure, so that we can build investment around it. And thirdly, how we can work together around unlocking the potential, the huge potential around renewable energy, around our young people, around our uncultivated arable land for food security, and the mineral wealth that we have in our continent to drive our own development by leveraging on resources, investment, technology from the US to unlock our own potential. I am very clear in my mind what it should look like.
Mr. President, asante sana. William Ruto, everybody, thank you very, very much.